temporarily anyway. Hello and welcome to the Inside Scoop. I'm Pat Riley. We want to welcome our guest. We have a candidate for Congress with us, Joseph Selvaggi. Thank you for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for having me, Pat.
Yes. Now you are running for Congress for one of the two districts that Rainham is now involved in.
Indeed, I'm running for the 8th Congressional District. Rainham has the honor of having 2 congressional districts in one small town.
For the first time.
For the first time. I'd like to say you're going to have twice the coverage, not half the coverage. So I happen to be precincts 1 and 2 of Rainham, but it's 1/9 of the state. For your listeners who weren't aware that things have changed, Massachusetts as a state lost one of its congressional districts. So we used to have 10 congressmen that would go to Washington. Now we'll have 9. So the same state was divided into 9 pieces instead of 10.
Because we lost population? Or?
Well, that, but more than that was that the rest of the country grew at a faster rate than we did. So we only have 435 members of the House of Representatives. We always have We always have two senators, 100 senators for the nation, 50 times 2, but it's a proportional share of the House of Representatives. So we're 9/435 of the House of Representatives. Back when we were one of the original colonies, Massachusetts was terrifically important. Now we're only 9 out of 435. So it's a very large district. Raynham represents the southern edge of the district. It goes all the way from Boston down to Bridgewater along the coast. I like to tell people it goes from the Swan Boats to Scituate. So it's quite a big place. 24 towns, 3 cities, Boston, Quincy, and Brockton. And then many of the very smaller bedroom communities, if you will, like Raynham is part of the district.
So that's a very large district.
It is. It's
a
700.
Diverse district.
A diverse district. 727,514 members of that diverse district. So we have urban centers and we have more rural centers, like the beautiful town of Raynham. It's rural, but what I like to tell people is how the cities go, so go the suburban or surrounding communities. We perhaps may love to live in a beautiful community like Raynham, but we need some place to work. And if our cities like Boston and Quincy and Brockton thrive, if they're good places for businesses to open up, then all the towns will follow suit. I think we'll all do better. Everything from job opportunities to home prices, all are a function of a regional dynamic, not merely town by town.
Tell us about your background.
Sure. Well, I will say, first of all, I'm the grandson of immigrants. I'm a Navy veteran of the first Gulf War. I'm a graduate of Worcester Polytechnic Institute and Harvard University. But perhaps what I'm best known for is I'm an entrepreneur. I'm a guy who started a company called Plaster Fun Time. It's a drop-in painting place for kids. It was an idea we came up with 17 years ago. Our first store was in Reading. And since it was a good idea 17 years ago, we've grown it to stores all over Massachusetts. We actually even have a manufacturing company in Somerville. So in a nutshell, kids come in and paint plaster figurines. I started that company 17 years ago really for the simple reason, same reason I'm running for Congress, which is to say I wanted to change the world. I wanted to make the world a better place by improving children's self-esteem. I like to say they walk in thinking they're great painters and they leave absolutely certain they're great painters. So what was a good idea 17 years ago now employs nearly 60 people here in Massachusetts. We do nearly 10,000 children's birthday parties a year. And I'm very proud of what we've built, and I think it informs me as a candidate for U.S. Congress.
Absolutely. Where are some of the locations?
Well, in the district, the closest here would be we have a store in Braintree and in Dedham. It's not in the district, but I guess it's close to us in Framingham or in Newton, and then various locations around the state.
Have you ever run for political office before?
No, I've never been the candidate. I've helped others run for office. I've helped other local and congressional candidates run for office. And it was my hope when I was, again, as an entrepreneur, what I did was I decided to go back to school. I went to the Harvard Kennedy School with the expectation that I would learn everything there was to know about how government works and then perhaps work on someone else's campaign. One thing I learned while I was at the Kennedy School is that the world is in a bit of trouble. That when you do the numbers and you realize and you look behind the curtain and you see how bad things are, you realize there's no time to waste. We're in a very, very difficult situation. And their motto is, if not you, then who? If not now, then when? That was never more true than right now. I think our country is in dire straits. I don't want to be known, or perhaps our parents or grandparents may be part of the greatest generation. I don't want to be a member of the last generation because we are in some deep trouble right now.
How do you assess that? How do we get here? What do we do wrong?
That's a very good but complex question. I like to tell people that if we talk about the problems, right now we're borrowing a great deal of money. And people are fond of talking about how much we borrow, that we're borrowing from the Chinese perhaps. But I like to say, well, the Chinese want their money back. What we're doing is borrowing from our children. And the magnitude of that borrowing, just last year alone, was $1.6 trillion. Now, trillion sounds like a big number. I say it rhymes with billion, it rhymes with million. But to put a fine point on it, the tsunami in Japan last year, it was an earthquake that leveled cities and then were washed away by a tidal wave. And then a nuclear meltdown made a catastrophic event. That whole event cost Japan $300 billion. So last year alone, our government borrowed, not spent, but borrowed more than 5 tsunamis. That's the magnitude of the problem. I also point to the fact that I think many of your listeners may know this familiar quotation about the fact that we borrow 40 cents out of every dollar. That may not sound like a lot. To me, it sounds like a lot. But to put that in perspective, that represents the entire cost of our federal government and our defense. So that means all the 60% that we take in taxes goes to Social Security, Medicare and Medicaid, and the interest on the debt. So were we to close down our government and wipe out our Department of Defense, we still don't take enough in taxes to support the entitlement programs as they exist today. So the first step in solving a problem is addressing the magnitude of the problem. These are not small tweaks we need to make. These are profound reforms that we need to make to our tax structure, to our healthcare system, to our entitlement programs, and we need to have someone with the leadership and the courage to go to Washington and say, the status quo is unacceptable.
What's your campaign strategy? Because obviously you have ideas what you want to accomplish, but you have to get elected.
Sure.
And it's a large district.
That little thing. Yeah, sure, it is a large district. Well,
and you are running against an incumbent.
I am running against an incumbent.
Even though he hasn't been our congressman.
He hasn't been your congressman. So I've been running for 8 months, and we were successful in winning our primary. And I hope to win the general election in the same way. When people tell me, they say, how are you going to beat the incumbent? I say, I can't. I can't. You can beat the incumbent. And what we effectively have to do is energize the people in the respective communities to get behind the candidate. They understand how their community works better than I do. So what we have are team captains in each of the 24 communities. In the case of Boston, we actually have ward captains. And they have lists to call, doors to knock on, and ways to get activated. They stand out, do standouts, have lawn signs. I learned firsthand, and I learned this at school, but I didn't really believe it, that campaigns and people get elected by boots on the ground. Ideas are terrific, and I think many of your listeners decide on who to vote for by who has better ideas, and I hope they do that. I think we've got the best ideas. But a good portion of the victory is attributable to door knocking, to standing out, and really just getting out and meeting people. I speak to any organization that'll listen to me, and I'm happy to take any questions. I hand out my business card, an unfiltered business card. Someone, if they have a problem, they can call me directly. It's interesting being running for Congress. I get calls. I got a call from just last night from a woman from South Boston who was very unhappy about where they had moved a dog park. It was near her retirement home. She can hear the dogs barking, and she considered this an important issue to talk to a congressional candidate. I was flattered to have gotten the call, and I reminded her just what you had said, which is, I can't solve your problem if I don't get elected. So there are big problems, but again, it doesn't matter unless I get elected. So what I'd say to your listeners, this is not a spectator sport. This is not like watching the Red Sox. If you want change, you have to do something. There's no department in charge of making sure the right guy wins. It's you. So if there's one message I'd like to convey to your listeners, it's that you should get involved. Your future's on the line, your children's future's on the line, and this great country is at risk. I think we need to make some big changes.
Well, you see the presidential race is tightening, the Senate race is tightening, so obviously there's possibilities for election there on both sides.
Well, if you look at the district the way it's drawn now, there have been Republicans, and I am a Republican, that have won. You look at Scott Brown took 56.1% of this district as it's drawn today. Charlie Baker took this district as it's drawn today. So there's always an opportunity. But it's not a referendum on Republican versus Democrat. I really believe people are looking for a change. They know that the person who's the incumbent isn't going to change. And we know, because he has a record and I don't, that we can look back on the past 11 years and say, well, what has this guy done for us? And really, I've yet to run into someone who says, you know, I think he's made our state, our district, our country a better place. He's effectively done nothing. So if we can let people know that there's a choice, I think we've got a real shot. I think Scott Brown paved the way and let people know it's always good to have a choice. You can't run a single-party state because nobody's right all the time. Now, I don't know if my wife's listening. Not even my wife is right 100%.
Now, what would you do if you are elected? What would be your priorities, and what positions would you take?
Well, I mentioned our debt, our deficit, and our jobs situation. For me, jobs is a big part of the solution. My campaign is, the website is joeforjobs.com. As a small business owner, I understand the issues that affect small businesses like mine. Small businesses like mine create 2 out of every 3 jobs in America. So if I can't grow, no one can grow. And if no one can grow, the country's in big trouble. Our unemployment rate has ticked down to 7.8%. It just shows you how our expectations have changed. If that's a good number, I remember when George Bush was running, 5.4% was an unacceptably high rate at that time. So I'd like to see small businesses like mine be able to hire. So what keeps me from hiring? The cost of employees and the cost of doing business. So the 3 major areas that I would address in Congress would be our tax code. It's 88,000 pages long, and we have the highest corporate tax rate in the world. Regulation, again, terrifically complex and not designed for people like me. And then the cost of health care. From day one, Plaster Fun Time, as small as we are, health care is a priority. All of our employees had health care from day one. We paid half their premium, they paid half the premium. And as the years have gone on, those double-digit increases in health care premiums have meant that despite the raises they get each year, their take-home pay is actually less each year. That has to end. We've seen what's happened with Obamacare and the promise that it was going to bring down health care costs. As a guy on the front lines, it hasn't brought down my health care costs. And in fact, what I see is the projections to the future. It's added 31 million people to what I believe is a profoundly broken system. And we haven't hired any doctors. We've hired IRS agents. So I don't think that the president himself believes that Obamacare is going to bring down the cost of health care. That we have to address that issue. If we can bring down the cost of health care, we bring down the cost of hiring people. You bring down the cost of hiring people, it makes it easier for people like me and larger businesses. And I say every large company was once a small company like mine. So if we can get people like me thriving again, the country back to work, you've got more people working, more people paying taxes, and we've got a little more flexibility on how we solve things. The other issue is, of course, our tax code. It's 88,000 pages long. None of those pages are exemptions written for me, and perhaps not for you either, Pat. So those are written by powerful lobbyists and powerful interests that go to Washington and petition their congressmen for an exception. If you analyze our tax code, as I say, we're not taking in enough taxes. We've got about $1.3 trillion worth of what's called tax expenditures. These are exemptions given to powerful interests that allow them to avoid paying their taxes. Now, it may not sound like a Republican to say everyone needs to pay his fair share, but I think when I listen to the voters in the new 8th District, that's all they're asking for. They want everybody to pay his fair share of taxes, and that's what I'm for. As a small business owner, as a working man like the people in the district, I just want a fair shake. And we have to realize when our leaders are in their meetings making their policy decisions, you and I are not invited. The people who are invited are very, very powerful interests. I'd like to see an end to that. I'd like to see a simplification. I believe sunlight is the best disinfectant. We can simplify our tax code, apply it more uniformly to everyone, and I think we'll find in that solution the opportunity, in fact, to actually reduce rates. That shouldn't be as complicated as it sounds. For the cynics on the left will say, well, GE and the rich millionaires and billionaires, they don't pay a cent of taxes. I say, okay, then if you want to raise their rates, let's say we double their taxes, what's 2 times 0? Effectively, that's my point. I'm saying it's not their rate, it's the fact that it's not applied to them. It's what they actually pay in taxes, not their tax rate. So I think those are some powerful changes. Again, when we talk about tax rates, I said we have the highest tax rate in the world. It's 35% here in the United States. The average of the countries that we compete with, they're called the OECD nations, they're the modern nations of the world. The average among those nations is only 25.8%. Now, when I chose to put my factory in Somerville, I had a couple of things to decide. I live in Boston. I said, well, where would I like to have my factory? I could put it in Cambridge, I could put it in Boston, I could put it in Somerville. I wanted to be where the people were. That satisfied her. I wanted to be close to my house because I want to keep an eye on the place.
Right.
But I wanted the lowest tax rate. And in fact, Somerville has a commercial tax rate, $6 per square foot lower than Boston. That made my decision easy.
Sure.
Love Boston, Somerville was cheaper. I don't have the opportunity to go beyond those choices. But if I'm Boeing, if I'm Apple, if I'm GE, I can choose between the United States, I can choose China, I can choose India. If we're not competitive tax-wise, regulation-wise, cost of healthcare, they're going to take their factories elsewhere, despite the fact that any good factory site person wants to be near where the educated employees will be, and also near their customers, and we're the customers of the world. So those are just common sense approaches to improving our job situation. I think when you improve the job situation, everything else falls into place.
What about spending? Do you think there needs to be cuts in spending as well?
Indeed, cuts in spending are important. I actually think that there are better ways to address. I mean, you're seeing what's been called the tax cliff or the tax-mageddon, this sequestration, where we have to make uniform cuts across the board. That's the worst possible way to do it, because we're not assessing the value of each program. We're just taking an axe and lopping off 10%. I'd like to see us reform our healthcare system. I believe that is the linchpin that will solve everything. We spend on average about $8,000 per man, woman, and child in America on health care, which is roughly about twice what the rest of the world pays. I really think that's because our health care system is broken. When you look at that large number per person, half is spent by the federal government. Well, we could do better. I think if we introduce real market reforms to health care and make it, like all market reforms, better and cheaper, that will go a long way to bringing down our debt and deficit. We do need reform in our large entitlement programs. I want to see Medicare and Social Security survive into the future, and we need to do some important details. So when I was born in 1965, my life expectancy was 76. Okay, now my life expectancy is 86. I'm thrilled to have picked up the extra 10 years. But I'll say that our entitlement programs need to adjust to
and
address.
People are they're healthier longer and they're working longer.
Of course. I'm not saying we need to force people to work longer. I think we want to provide the tax incentives that they're not penalized if they do want to work longer. The seniors I know think work is a great opportunity. They they don't want to do back-breaking physical work as they get older, but they do want to have the opportunity to participate, keep their minds and bodies active as long as is possible. But they're not going to do that if there's tax penalties for that. So I think we can make everybody happy if we make some small changes to the way our entitlement programs work, so that increases in benefits may be reduced a bit if you are in the higher income bracket, that the age at which you can maximize your benefits may increase a little bit, and those changes would be done with enough time for people to plan. I wouldn't have that imposed immediately. People have made choices based on the plan as it is today, but someone who's in his 30s and 40s, if those changes are made in a meaningful, sensible way, can adjust and plan how they want to make their retirement years work. Right now, we've got a $38 trillion unfunded mandate in Medicare. So I believe on the other side of the aisle, the Democrats are frankly in denial. We need to make changes. So I believe I've got a plan, or I have at least the desire to create a better plan. And we're looking at opposition that really is trying to preserve the status quo. And the status quo will end. It's just whether we do it deliberately or not. I'd like to make careful, meaningful, agreed upon across the aisle adjustments to our programs. If we wait for it to collapse, the choices will be taken from us.
What's your take on the stalemate in Congress at this point? The fact that nobody seems to be able to do anything.
Sure. Well, what I'll say about Congress is, unfortunately, and Massachusetts is no different, if Massachusetts keeps sending our Democrats and Texas keeps sending its Republicans, it should be no surprise that when we meet, we have no idea what the other side's talking about. But I'd like to say humbly that if Massachusetts can send a few Republicans and Texas can send a few Democrats, we might have something to talk about. Because, frankly, I live in Boston. I don't know, half of my supporters, half of my contributors are Democrats. I went to graduate school in Cambridge. I understand both perspectives. I understand the compassion of our Democratic friends. I understand the fiscal responsibility of our Republican friends. That's how we're going to come to some common ground. It's not necessarily bipartisanship, it's honest debate. I'd say, okay, as long as we have a solution, as long as time, if we put time into that variable, we put a big number in there and say, okay, in 10 years, in 20 years, in 30 years, how will we pay for this? You know, we can debate more taxes and bigger government, small taxes, small government, but there's no one who, in my mind, can defend what we're doing now, which is borrowing our children's money for the government we're getting today. They're not, talk about taxation without representation. I'm a guy who started Plaster Fun Time. I care about kids. The kids I see in my store, I do everything I can to make sure their experience is a good one. But we're borrowing their money. We're borrowing their money to the tune of $4 billion a day. It's just not right. We need to come to a solution where we balance our budgets today.
Now, obviously, in Congress, you not only have input into domestic issues, but also international. What
Sure.
are your positions as far as that and military?
Well, as I say, I am a veteran myself. Not that that gives anybody any unique insight into war and foreign policy, but as far as I'm concerned, we have a Department of Defense, and we need to make sure that our interests are preserved across the world. That said, I've had friends who have been injured or killed in war. I'd be very reluctant if we take, let's say, Syria, for instance, to go on a new adventure and get involved in a war whereby we certainly understand who the bad guys are. I don't think we understand who the good guys are. Once that first boot of American goes on to the ground, we become the enemy. And I'm not eager to line up to be that region's enemy. I'm excited about the opportunity to use our forces to help in a humanitarian way. But if our interests are not directly threatened in the region, we unfortunately, as bad as things are, need to let the region sort out the problems, help where we can, but I'm not an advocate of risking the lives of soldiers and Marines defending an interest that we're really not even clear about.
What about military spending?
Military spending, well, when I was in the military, we spent about 8% of GDP. This is just at the end of the Cold War. I date myself, right? Right now, we're between, we've talked about, depending on how the cuts come down in the sequestration, just below 3% or just above 3%. I'd like to see us reduce our spending in a meaningful way. There are many programs that even the Department of Defense doesn't think is a good idea. So there are ways to reduce, but I don't want to reduce our readiness. We have all kinds of threats across the world. We want to make sure our goods and services and products can flow freely around the world. And that is both in the Middle East, we hear about that a lot, but also on the other side of the world, in Asia. I want to make sure that our military is strong enough that it doesn't encourage other militaries to challenge us. I've often had it quoted, and again, we talk about the Kennedy School and public policy issues, that our defense budget is more than the other 17 countries combined. You can look at it two ways. One is it's either absurdly high and gratuitous. It's unnecessarily high. Or you can look at it the way I do, which is to say, by virtue of the fact that we do have a strong military, it discourages or makes unnecessary for all the other nations of the world to spend huge amounts on their Army, Navy, and Air Force,
The
Marines.
quote I heard the other day is the only way to win a war is to prevent it.
To prevent it. I would love to, and we've done that. I don't want to go back to the good old days of the 1930s where all of us had about the same force, and war ensues, and its result is a coin toss. So we came to the brink, as there's still many of us alive today who saw World War, and I don't want to go back to the good old days. So as it is now, I think our military is effective. It is enough of a deterrent to others to build up their own forces, and I think it's an assurance to the rest of the world that as long as we don't go on all these adventures abroad, and we do use our force for humanitarian reasons and to keep lines of communication, lines of commerce free, that's about what people are looking for. They don't want us nation building. I think we should be involved diplomatically in nation building. We should do what we can to encourage democracy in the Middle East and elsewhere, but militarily, that's another story. I don't want to see soldiers and Marines committed to nation building.
Believe it or not, we just have about 3 minutes
Oh
left.
my goodness,
so
it's
what
zooming,
else
it's
would you
zooming
like
by.
to tell our viewers?
Well, what I'd say to your viewers is that this contest, this race, is not about Republicans and Democrats. It's not about left and right. It's about the status quo, if you believe that is the way forward, or we need profound change. I often quote my brother, who's not into politics, and he says to me, don't worry about all that stuff. Just answer one question. He said, why should I care? What does it matter to me who I send to Washington as my representative in the House of Representatives? And it's my hope in this conversation I can make the point. I'm challenging an incumbent who has a very, very light record of legislation, one who has very poor marks as far as his scores against waste. He has been on the banking committee through the banking collapse. He's effectively not done a good job. Now, I don't want to bring up baseball, but I like Bobby Valentine. He's a good guy. Our incumbent representative in Congress, he's a good guy. But if he's not getting the job done, you need to let him go and choose someone else. So I invite your listeners to go online. My website is joeforjobs.com. Find out about my policies and my background, and then make a deliberate choice. If you merely go into the voting booth and vote with the party, nothing is going to change. This great country and the future of your children relies on your vote. When I tell people I'm running for Congress, the number one question I get is, who died? Because they don't believe you can actually change or challenge somebody in Congress. And I'm saying America is about democracy and choice. We need to make that choice. We need to hold our leaders accountable. If they're not effective, we need to let them go and choose someone else who will be. So I'm honored for the opportunity to represent the 8th Congressional District. It's a very special district. It's where the Declaration of Independence was read for the first time. It's where one if by land, two if by sea in the Old North Church. It's the city of Presidents in Quincy. It's a very special district where our nation began. We deserve a real leader to represent us in Washington.
With that, we want to thank you very much for stopping by and visiting us here on the Inside Scoop. Guest today, Joe Selvaggi, candidate for Congress. And certainly we want to encourage everybody to make sure they turn out and vote.
Yes, thank you very much.
Okay,
Thank you very much.
for being with us. We'll see you here on our next episode of the Inside Scoop.
Thank you.